You know, I'm not going to do justice to history of Christendom because I'm going to skip 1,000 years. Between yesterday's session on the councils and the canon and the creeds, I'm going to move right up to the day of Luther, where we see the Reformation, skipping right past the Crusades and the breakup of the Roman Empire, which all, by the way, was significant in their own rights. And again, I would encourage you, you know, just to find an appropriate book to read about all the ins and outs of it. This is a very good book I want to recommend. It's called Turning Points by Mark Knoll, Decisive Moments in the History of Christianity. An excellent book, easy to read, not very history-like in that sense, you know. So this is a book worth getting if you are interested to explore some of these themes that we've been looking at further. Okay, yesterday when our movie started, Luther, it began at a point where the church, especially the Western church, was really corrupting and it's degrading, right? In terms of corruption within the papacy, and also how the bishops and the church was very involved politically and very closely linked with the state. And the 10th and the 11th centuries were especially bad. And of course, we see in the beginning of the movie just how bad it has become. You know, the Pope was more interested in his power, in money, more than really the spiritual life of the church. But the point is, the church was more than one era in such a condition, because even before the point of Reformation, where you saw yesterday, the church was more than once in far worse condition than at the time that we witnessed in the movie yesterday. There were various points where genuine Christian leaders wanted to bring changes and revival to the church, and they were able to do so to a certain degree, but yet after a while it went back to its original state of corruption, and sometimes even worse. And of course, that's where the movie started yesterday in the 16th century, where there was real substantive problems in the church, and it got to a point where it was so bad that I believe, you know, God really had his hand heavily upon the church through the ministry of Luther and his group of friends. There were many factors that brought about the Protestant Reformation, and we'll look at some of them. And I'll say a little bit about indulgences and bring it back to our present day application. Are they indulgences, so-called indulgences in our evangelical churches today? And that's where the point we'll bring into our discussion groups again. Before we go on, let's just commit this time to the Lord. Father, we want to thank you for being with us the last few days and helping us to look at how the early church has contributed so much, O Lord, to our faith. And I just pray, even as we look at the Reformation, help us to look at the Reformation not with not just see the positive side, but also to accept and see that the people who brought about the Reformation were not perfect people either. And that serves, in a sense, encouragement to us, because that means that, Lord, you can too use us, O Lord, in your church, in bringing about real change and transformation in your church today. I pray that even as we look at some of the problems with the church in the 16th century, help us not to be proud to say, oh, those days were bad. Help us to see that today we have similar issues, oh God, and help us to find our role and our task in what we need and how we need to respond to you at where we are today. Be with us. I pray that you will teach us through your Holy Spirit, And I pray, oh God, that you would be pleased with what we do here this morning. In the name of your Son, who has been so gracious, oh Lord, and merciful to us. In Jesus' name, amen. One of the factors that brought about the Reformation was the abuses that was happening within the papacy. They were more concerned with amassing political power. It was no longer just merely about spiritual concerns. They were very interested in fact, a lot of them were more politician than spiritual leaders, right? Some of them were warriors rather than a spiritual shepherd. And you noticed from the movie last night too, I thought it was a great depiction of how some of them were amassing great wealth. You know, the gold that they have around them, some of the relics that they collected, which was very interesting. Some of the papacy itself practiced open immorality. It wasn't just immorality in secrecy. Some of them practiced it openly, and they were not ashamed of it. For example, Innocent VIII, who lived between 1482 to 1492, he fathered 16 children. All right, he fathered 16 children. They're supposed to be celibate. But he fathered 16 children. If I'm not wrong, I think by different women. I cannot remember by how many different women. And he openly celebrated the weddings of his children in the Vatican. Can you imagine how blatant it has become? That they no longer, not only are they ashamed, they openly celebrate their immorality. So abuses in the papacy was going on in increasing degree and increasing frequency. Then, of course, there's the worldliness of the church and the clergy. Greed is seen in the number of offices some of these clergymen were holding. They were holding more than one office. They were selling the church offices in the sense that, okay, if you want to be like, you want to be a bishop of a certain area, well, you pay me money, I'll let you be the bishop kind of thing. You know, this is what they call simony. The Archbishop Albert of Mainz, I think yesterday in the movie he was referred to, he was simultaneously the Bishop of Magdeburg and the Bishop of Halberstadt as well. So you see, they hold two different, because with every office that they hold, they actually get a cut, right, from the so-called earnings of the church. They will get a cut of the revenue. In fact, Albert, yesterday in the movie, we saw how he got 50% of the indulgence money that was collected in his territory. And he was very mad, right, when Luther was standing in the way of him collecting a lot of money from his indulgences. And at that time too, the bishops and the church leaders, they were actually also collecting money for some of their services that they perform. Can you imagine if today's church, you want to be baptized, you have to pay the pastor a certain amount of money to be baptized, or if you want to, want him to perform your marriage for you, you have to give him money. But that was the case at that time. On top of paying for indulgences, on top of, giving to the church, the congregation is expected to pay the clergy for some of the services that they perform: baptism, penance, indulgences, the sale of indulgences, and so on and so forth. So, everything has got to do with money. Everything's got to do with money. Now, lest we think, oh, these people are just so mercenary. Today, if you turn on, probably not in Singapore, they don't have Christian TV. If you go to places like the US or in India, they have what they call Christian TV, right? And if you turn on, you see all these so-called evangelists asking for money as well. If you want your prayer answered, send $2 or send your money to this, call this number and send us how much, and we'll pray for you and see your prayers answered. Have you seen those? Right? So before we point our fingers and say, oh, those people back then, were so mercenary, we see that happening today as well. And sometimes it's actually much more, what's the word I'm looking for? Implicit than what you see. Organizations, recently I read of an organization that has very good standing, actually. They were asking for money, and somebody asked for them to declare their accounts, and they found that there was some some sections of the accounts that were very questionable as to where did they spend this kind of money. So things like that still happen very much so today. And another reason that's brought about the Protestant Reformation is there was a lot of the emphasis, very pietistic emphasis on sin and salvation. In other words, to be saved, you have to do something to be saved, rather than trusting in the Lord in faith on the grace of God. During the Middle Ages and at the time of the Reformation, there was often a very mechanical and superstitious approach to religion, which is very sad because remember, yesterday we looked at how the Roman religions were very mechanistic, very legalistic. And this is exactly where the church has gotten to 1,000 years later. It's fallen into the same pit where it's become very mechanistic, very legalistic, and that's why you see people were buying indulgences, because they felt that by doing so, they're actually getting saved. There was a lot of saint worship. You remember that scene where Luther was making his way to the meeting and they were all like, they're all bowing down to him, calling him, and he's like, I'm not a saint, don't worship me, I'm not a saint. There was a lot of image worship, images of the saints, and in fact, bowing down before idols of Jesus. Superstitious rites and ceremonies and traditions that were imposed by some of this, by the church at that time. There were also mechanical recitals of Ave Marias, just by saying the Ave Maria, for example, you could be saved from a certain danger. It's very superstitious, right? Pilgrimages to holy shrines, you have to make a pilgrimage at least once in your life or once a year to the Vatican City. If you are a spiritual man, you would do that, and so on. And because of this very mechanistic and very legalistic approach to spirituality, there rose a group of Christians, of believers, who felt that the spiritual life, the Christian life, is not about legalistic outward things that you do. And it was also around this time that a lot of mystic writers came into existence, where they start writing about the deep spiritual life. They were very influential in causing people to hunger for true spirituality. That spiritual life has nothing to do with how many times you pray, for example, but rather how you pray. Your spiritual life has got to do with your relationship with God. It's got nothing to do with how many indulgences you buy and you pick up. And a lot of these mystic writers, people like Thomas à Kempis, and if you look up mystic writers, those who have your iPads with you, you find a list of some of these writers. And in fact, some of these writings are amazing. For myself, I start my morning by reading Thomas à Kempis' Imitation of Christ, because a lot of what he writes about instigates a deeper longing for communing with God, to become more and more like Jesus. And it was also this batch of mystic writers that was starting to encourage people to have a deeper thirst for true spirituality, for a true life with God. And then that's where sort of the place where Martin Luther comes into the picture, right? Where he, firstly, of course, he experiences the incident where there was thunder and lightning, and he was struck, and he was the fear of God in him. And of course, everything else I don't have to go on, because you saw the movie, and how he found that he can never be sure of his own salvation. He can never be sure whether he is in a right place with God or not. And he struggled with that. And I think that brought him to a point where he began to see that perhaps, of course, it wasn't very easy for him, as you notice, he was always fighting with Satan in that sense when he was praying, right? He was struggling in his soul. Like, on one hand, he wants to believe that this is a God who is gracious and merciful. On the other hand, because he comes from a background and a worldview that teaches that you have to do certain things for you to be in the right position with God, he struggles with that. How can I know for sure I try my best, I do all this, but how can I be sure? And he was scrubbing the floor, remember? How can I know? How can I be sure that I am right with the Lord? And of course, what he ended up teaching was, he was teaching that our inward righteousness was the gift of God, and this was really based on his own experience and on his own struggle, that he came to a point where he realized that our righteousness is a gift from God, and God is the source of our righteousness, and not our own works. Nothing that we can ever do on our own will set us righteous before God, but it is a gift from God himself. In other words, we are not righteous because we do good works, but we do good works because we are righteous. So it's a complete flip around from the general thinking in those days, where you have to do certain things to be righteous. Now, Luther's significance, really, if you think about it, his teaching about inward righteousness is not something that's new, right? Because go back to the first the early Christians, they understood that and they knew that very clear. But the church somehow have lost sight of what true righteousness meant. And I think the significance of Luther is in the fact that he provided the church, or rather he reminded the church, okay, for the reason of her existence after having lost sight of what it means to be righteous before God. And his significance in church history, let me put it that way, lies in the fact that he appeared at the right time and at the right place to have been able to bring about a real change in the church. So, in other words, some critics of Luther say, the people make so much of Martin Luther and what he did, but he was anti-Semitic, for example, and there were some other nasty, evil things that he did in his life. And I'm sure he wasn't a perfect man, and we shouldn't take all that he taught and he wrote about to be gospel truth in a sense. He had his faults, but the Lord nonetheless used him, and the Lord used him to bring the church back to where she ought to be. Okay, so we don't see Luther with rose-tinted glasses in that sense, but to see him as a flawed man that God used to bring reformation to the church. One of the significant things about what Luther taught about God was he believed that the idea of God was paradoxical, and I think this is an important feature that theme that I want to bring up when we look at Luther. He felt that the idea of God was paradoxical because for us to understand the one who made heaven and earth, it was necessary to know the powerlessness that hung on the cross. And basically, to conceive the moral perfection of the divine is necessary to understand the scandal, the pain, and the shame of a criminal's execution. He's really bringing us back right to the cross. If you want to know the God who created all, the glory and the power of the creator of the heavens and the earth, you have to look to the cross where the creator of the universe hung shamefully and helplessly on the cross. That's why he found it paradoxical. In order to understand the powerful, you have to see how powerlessly he hung from the cross, And he brings us really back to the cross. And he says to find God was to find the cross. And you see, even in the movie, throughout his life, he struggled with that. He struggled with the fact that he wants to find God. And what does it mean to find God at where he is, to see God at where he is? How can he understand what it meant to hang powerlessly on the cross? And this is what he calls the theology of the cross, where he says Christianity becomes a reality in our lives when we enter into Christ's death by suffering the destruction of their own pretensions as they stand in the presence of God. Basically, for you to understand who God is, if you want to know this God, you enter into Christ's death on the cross. You identify with him as he hangs on the cross and understand what it was like when he suffered the destruction on the cross. And that's only when our own pretensions of who we are dies along with it. To live is gain, to die is Christ. And this idea of God for Luther meant a lot to him, and he spoke much about the theology of the cross. He's written a lot on it. And related to this too, he juxtaposes this theology of the cross with the theology of glory, which he believed was a mindset that is directly opposing the theology of the cross, because he saw the theology of glory in his time. When he looked at the clergy, when he looked at the papacy, he see how they were seeking glory for themselves. They were seeking power in the offices that they held. And he juxtaposed it, and he said the theology of the cross, what is opposing the theology of the cross is the theology of glory. And basically, the theology of glory is one that encourages humans to trust themselves, to make their own efforts the basis of their security in this life and the life to come. And what it does, it suggests that people do what lies within their own power to be up and doing. Okay? If you want to gain acceptance with God, you are always up and doing to gain acceptance from themselves, from God, from people around them. And what it ultimately means is that we can please God on our own through our works. It makes us think that what we do for God matters most in creating a spiritual life rather than what God has done for us. It means that what we do for God matters most in creating a spiritual life rather than what God has done for us. I think it's very closely related to what LT has been talking about this weekend, where sometimes, especially with regards to the gift of speaking, I think, or teaching, where just because you're teaching something, it may lead you to believe that you're actually living the life that you're teaching about, when you may not necessarily be so. You see where I'm going? Just because you are speaking the truth does not necessarily mean that you are living the truth. And ultimately, what really matters most is that you are living the truth. And you live the truth by first allowing God to transform you before you can actually do what is right. And this was a truth that Luther found to be very real for himself. Now, Luther himself was not against human activity, or was he denouncing the contribution and role of traditions and church structures. And in fact, he was, even after the Reformation, he was actually quite Catholic still in his beliefs and his practice of his faith. But what he understood was that nothing that he could do would be able to bring him to a point of righteousness before God. Now, next I want to look at what are some of the indulgences that they talk about in the movie yesterday. What is your take after watching the movie, what these indulgences are? Without looking at my notes.
If you buy the indulgence, if you pay for the indulgence, you spend less time in purgatory.
Mm-hmm.
Or in the case of the movie, he was buying it for his grandfather or something.
Mm-hmm.
So you are paying so that your grandfather spends less time in purgatory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Basically, it's purchase of pardon to emit time in purgatory. In some cases, you actually skip purgatory. You just go straight to heaven. The definition and description of purgatory is basically, as the name implies, is a place where you purge out whatever leftover sins or evil that you have. After we die, even though you die a believer in Christ, in God, you may not necessarily be ready for heaven. So this is a place where you would be purged and you will be purified further before your soul is ready for heaven. So when you buy an indulgence, basically you know, you can use that as a passport, I guess, passport out of purgatory and go straight to heaven. Yes, Chris, did you have something to say?
So they say that buying salvation is not right. And
Mm,
also purgatory is not mentioned a lot, like throughout the New Testament or whatever. Is it some form of hell or
purgatory? Yeah, well, it's not a hell. It's a place of purification in that sense. They talk about in purgatory, you will be refined by fire. That's why remember that scene where he had his hand on the fire, you know,
is
to
it like
scare.
a biblical concept or
No.
come up with a
No, it's purgatory is a place that is in between heaven and earth. It is not biblical. I think. Remember yesterday when we talked about the canon of scriptures? Some of the later books that were added into the Catholic Bible supports this doctrine. Which was of course interesting because they added in because they wanted to support the doctrine of purgatory. But no, it's not biblical. Of course, some of them have argued the different terms that were used in the Old Testament, like Sheol and all that, to refer to hell, and they say, oh, this may possibly, but there's no strong indication that that's the case. So purgatory is, of course, clearly, you know, a Catholic, Roman Catholic doctrine. And the purpose is basically to prepare you for heaven, you know, where it's purative, to further purify your soul for heaven. Yes, Amanda, interrupting the speaker again. Yes, go ahead. That's a good question. You know, I read this on LT. Do you remember where they got it from? You probably know.
is it from the Paul?
Yeah, but it's a call, but it wasn't really. That's why there was a recent talk recently about how the present pope might overrule that and overturn that and say that clergy, you know, can actually um, be married and not necessarily celebrate. It's not one of those not primary doctrines, would you call that, of the Roman Catholic Church, but they did use like Paul's call to celibacy as you want to serve the Lord wholeheartedly. This is the way to serve Him fully without concerns of family. So they basically use that as a basis, you know.
Yeah, I think both Jesus' teaching, some are called to be single.
Yes,
And Paul is saying that it is a gift. But Paul very clearly says that it's because of the present crisis.
correct,
I want you to remain because when people are married, their children under persecution, there was this emotional blackmail.
correct.
That people can be.
Yeah.
And but Paul also made it clear it is better to marry
Than to be burned in passion.
Some
Yeah.
of these unfortunate sexual things you've been hearing
Yeah.
about, the Catholic Church seems to prove Paul's point.
Yeah. And that's why the present Pope, because there's a decreasing number of people who are joining the church as parish, and also with all the sexual abuses that are going on in the Catholic Church, he's actually thinking about overturning that that ruling to remain celibate. So. Yes, yes, right. Yes, correct. Yeah, but it didn't. You know, that's the sad thing. It never stopped some of this thing, and never stopped all this immorality because, you know, subsequently today, you know, you read about how those days they were building tunnels that connected, you know, yeah, you know, between the monks and the nuns, you know, and all these illicit affairs that were going on, you know, which is very sad, of course. What kind of confessions are you talking about? It depends. Mm-hmm. Those who work as counselors today get that too, right? Where you listen to people download their issues to you. Okay, let's move on. There were different forms of indulgences at that time. Of course, the one that we saw yesterday was a certificate to say that you've given, and therefore this is the certificate to say that you have earned, you have bought this indulgence. Another one is to venerate some of these relics. And remember how many, all this room full of relics by the Prince Frederick, right? He had a room full of all these so-called relics. In fact, today you can see some of these relics in some of the museums in the Middle East, in Turkey, in a museum at is it in Hagia Sophia, or one of the museums. You can actually see like the bone of John the Baptist. Probably not his bone, or his femur or something. But these are some of the so-called relics that they had at that time, where if you venerate them, if you own them, even much better, a higher priced indulgence in that sense. And indulgences is really based on the Roman Catholics, what they call the system of penance, the 4 elements in penance. First is contrition, where you feel contrite of your sin. Secondly, when you confess before the priest. And then the priest will ask you to go and do this, right? Say how many Ave Marias, or go and do this, and you would be forgiven. And then when the priest say, if you do this, you will be absolved of your sin. And indulgence stand in the category where satisfaction by works is, where you buy something, and by owning something or by doing this, immediately you would have earned yourself forgiveness of sin for whatever that you have done. Let me see. Remember at one point in the movie at the church where Tetzel was saying that how Mary and Christ have all these merits, and Mary and Jesus wants to share from the treasury of merits. Remember? Basically, this is the belief that merits is holiness, basically. They have a bank of holiness, and because Mother Mary is so holy and Christ is so holy, and so are some of the saints that they venerate. They are so holy that they have a bank account of merits, and they can share them with you. You can have access to. So you don't necessarily have to be to live a holy life in that sense, but you can have a part in the holiness by doing something. And some of the things that you have to do is like, indulgences is one of the ways of sharing their holiness. And of course, the Roman Catholic Church believes that they have the key to, they have the password to this bank account of merits, that they can dispense these merits that belong to the saints of old, Mary and Jesus. And of course, we see how the indulgence system was being abused. When some of those in the papacy would say, it's their form of actually getting money. They were going to get 50% of the cut. And, it's so sad, right? A lot of these peasants were really poor, and they actually went in with good intentions only to be exploited by the church. But if you think about it, essentially, what is an indulgence? I mean, an indulgence is where you can buy something so as to escape, the wrath of God, or, going to purgatory. But essentially, what is it? Bribing God, basically. Essentially, it's an attempt to buy off God, right? Where, or in gangster language, is protection money. It's basically spiritual protection money, where you, to be sure, you buy this indulgence and say, now that I have this, I am protected for life. I'm sure, for sure, going to heaven is like my passport to heaven. It's the security against our sins through human resources, where you trust yourself, you trust your own resource to escape the wrath of God. And then, and indulgence too essentially is something that is an attempt to control God, right? Basically to say that we can control God's favor towards or against a person, right? By buying an indulgence, basically I'm buying God's favor. By buying an indulgence, I am able to escape purgatory and go straight to heaven because God is now favorable towards me. I have bought his favor. It is basically impersonal manipulation versus personal relationship. That means your relationship with God is no longer one that is of love and where you have personal communion with him, but rather is more of one of transaction that involves money, right? Where you can buy with money, where you can buy with your own natural resource. Now, here's my question. In today's church, what are some of the things that we do that are similar to some of these indulgences that that the church was giving out in those days? Can you think of some of that? And I can certainly think of, I don't know I have that in your notes or not, where we actually think we can bribe God by doing these things. And that's why when certain things happen to us, when crises happen to us, you know, we say, but Lord, I do all this for you. You know, how is it that this is happening to me? Right? And in fact, I think we do it all the time where we say, if you accept Jesus, you know, you will go to heaven. And it gives us some form of security, but if you stop there, it's not going to change you at all. It's just your salvation is merely just a passport to heaven. And I wonder if you really gain entry at the door of heaven. Right? So this is where I want you to bring into your groups to discuss. What are some of the evangelical indulgences that we see today, and what is wrong with these methods? Okay? And what is wrong with these methods? Did I give some of these answers in there? No, right? Okay, very good. So break into groups of 2 or 3, the usual group that you break into. And after 10 minutes, I'll come back and I will wrap this up and listen to some of your responses. Okay, I know you're having a good time of discussion, but let me just wrap this up very quickly. What are some of the highlights of your discussion from the different groups? Does one of you want to say something? What are some of the evangelical indulgences and what is wrong and right about these methods?
That's a good point.
Yes, Chris.
I think in some of the churches, you know, like you have been saying that this usually in a charismatic church, but when you start, you know, like making a concept, it start to creep into some evangelical churches. When you start to, when you give an offering, there's some kind of, instead of giving tithes, you know, like doing it a proper way, you are making some kind of incentivize the giving, you know, like.
Give an example.
Give an example, probably if you give, you have, if you forget to give a tithe, you know, God's blessing will fall upon you, that kind of stuff, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, like,
Give and you will receive tenfold over.
It's not that obvious, you know, but you know, like in some kinds, it's trying to make people feel guilty when they miss the 10%. Is it 10%? Okay, now it's a 10.1, I give more, but 9.9, you have a problem there, you know. And it start become like, I start saying this because people keep asking, should you do a 10% after your expenditure, or did you, and then you go into all these kind of tax, and I think sooner or later we'll have a tax consultant for offering. You know? I think it's a
That could be my next career.
yeah. But you see, like when people start doing counting, this kind of thing, that, you know, like, it
Something
starts
that
with
is
a
not- yeah,
strong
right, yeah.
understanding on the, that's, on the offering part itself.
Good point, good point. I think another thing that's similar is church building fund, right? Okay, what else? What other indulgences? Yes, Jeanette.
Like, let's say you want the business deal to go through very, very badly, so you say that the deal goes through, right, I'll give 10% of this,
This is so Chinese, right? Right?
It's Chinese evangelism.
No, it's very Chinese. The Chinese say, if this happens, I'm going to 完善. It's like in literal translation, it means to give back to God, right? So if this deal comes through, I'm going to give, have slaughtered chicken and buy fruits and return it to God.
But isn't that, some of the practice, like, I think in Bible there's I think Hannah or Samuel mom that when you say you give me some, give it to God, that kind of practice.
Yeah, just because you read it practiced doesn't make it normative. Yeah, I think correct. There is a Thanksgiving gift, but I think in this case it's really more of like
Bribing.
Yeah, bribing God. You have to give me because if you want me to give back to you, then you have to give me. That kind of thing.
It's transactional.
Yes. Correct. And of course, the definition of blessing is very much defined by material blessings as opposed to spiritual blessings. Right?
I'm going to say something a little bit controversial.
Yes.
I would say even that the tithe is a form of indulgence because it supposedly goes back to the old covenant. And well, even in the old covenant, they gave more than 10%, not just 10%. And the new covenant is giving of yourself, which means it's supposed to be more than 10%. So I would say that indulgences, when you go to the root of it, the root is grace plus. They needed to keep programs going, they needed to keep buildings going, and when it's grace plus, you need a steady stream of income to be coming in. And when you say, when you don't determine what percentage of the income is coming in, it's very subjective to keep programs going that way. And human beings being in their own fallen nature, whatever we earn, we want to keep to ourselves.
Yes.
So, to overcome all that, I would even say the 10%, the tithe, is an indulgence when Christ calls us to give more than 10%.
You are absolutely right, and I am in agreement with you because I'm not of the. I believe there is a strong basis to think that it's not just 10%. I know a lot of churches. In fact, I grew up in a church where they say tithe means 10%, but I think in the new covenant it's really to give as much as you can give back. Yes, LT.
It's actually not how much of my money I give to God. It's how much of God's money I keep for myself.
Exactly.
Otherwise, it becomes a transaction.
Exactly. Ministry. Yes, this group wants to say something. Louder, please. Can y'all hear? Y'all hear what she said? Basically, she's talking about like how even ministry in our serving God, we can also turn that around and say, Lord, we serve you, and therefore there's certain expectation of what God should do for us, right? Or if God, what was the other thing? The second part, praying and fasting, and all that, which are all good spiritual discipline, but that can easily be twisted into a form of indulgence, thinking that just because because we do this, therefore, you know, as opposed to seeking that as an end in itself. You know, we seek that as a means to something else. Yes, Chris.
I think there's also a prevalent problem that now Christian nowadays, their faith is not based on the historical incident which happened 2,000 years ago, but the faith based on, you know, after I accept Jesus, I will have a good life, I will have safe life, my life will be blessed, that kind of a better life, you know, like it's something like, you know, if you believe in something that can make you better kids, better, you know, all of these things is a bonus if God give it to us, but it should not be the basis.
See, yeah, that's the thing, you know, we talk about prosperity gospel, about how if you become a Christian, you know, then you will be blessed, your life will be, you know, your problems will roll away by and by kind of thing. You know, that's not going to work for some countries very clearly in the world. I know of friends that immediately after they become a Christian, they lose their job, their families kick them out of their house. You know, I met this man who, he became a believer 20 years ago. He lives in the Middle East. He came to know I mean, his story is amazing how he became a Christian. But since day one he's become a believer, his wife has been threatening wanting a divorce from him. What happened to this? You know, you will be blessed after you become a Christian. His life fell into complete chaos after he became a believer. You know, but he said he will never change his mind. You know, he said there's something. You know, he's found the truth. You know, not in the form of the so-called blessings that we expect, but the kind of blessings that the Lord deemed appropriate for us. I think there was this group, right, who said something about, would you, asking a new believer, right, would you want to be in heaven if Jesus is not there? Yes?
I just want to say that I think the need for money by churches and by church organizations is a very real thing. And actually when you think about it, tithing is actually a very fair concept, right? Because you give according to how much you have. Now, what churches and organizations are relying on today is actually just free will of grace. Now, what happened when this free will approach fails? Then what do you do?
I think there is a need for us to say a little bit more about how our money is not our own. I think there's a need to teach more about but basically all that we have is from God. All good is from God. I see a very different mindset, you know, because RZIMAP is an international organization. I find that support raising in the West is actually easier. Would you agree with me, LT? Than here in Asia, because I think there's this sense in Asia here that, you know, we work hard for our money, and I think it's again a very Chinese mentality as well, right? This is our money, you know. Even for Christian, we work hard. This is our money. So if I want to give away, I must make sure these people must prove to me that why I should give to them, right? Whereas in the West, I have found they're much more generous in a sense. Of course, it's also liable to being abused, you know, their naivety. You know, you just say, you present to them your needs, and they open their wallet very easily. You know, they say, this is for the Lord, you know, whatever I have. Perhaps it's got to do with a worldview that values, regardless of how pagan the West has become, but it does have the underlying, I guess, to a certain extent, still Christian value with regards to some of these things. But over here, it's much more difficult. They're much more tighter with their wallets than here. You see, I totally agree with you, brother, about the need for finance to run the ministry is very real. And I think some of the issues that most of us would have is the way that these organizations solicit money, I think. Yeah, there are always different sides to a coin. The point is trying to see how can we do this right and do this better.
Just just a comment on that. I think church, they have an operational fund and you know like their commission requirement. And I see two types of, especially in Medan, there's two kind of church. There's a church that openly put their account on the board, usually for the congregation to see. So when they see the needs and they understand, usually they give, I'm sure a lot of them they give more than 10%, and it's not like 10%, not because 10% is required by the Bible, so you have to do it, but out of their willingness to support, you know, the church, they will know there's a deficit, you know. But another kind of church that I've been seeing that do not put their account out, they just say you have to give 10% and then that's it. You know, you do not know where the money goes into, the accountability factor is not considered. And this is not all church, but I find it commonly, it leads to the abuse when you start telling the congregation, this is your, you have to give 10%. It removes the accountability sense to the congregation. I have to give 10% and that's it. You know, and that's just my comment.
Okay, one last comment about, yes.
Even all these things, church, what can we do to support out correct some of these statements?
Yes.
Bigger question.
Can invite I Ching and LP to your church to speak.
No, I think all of us definitely have a role to play. We might feel that, you know, it's just one of me, you know, but it always begins. I mean, look at what Luther did, right? God was able to use him. And so be encouraged. At the same time, we are probably not the only group here who realizes some of these things, you know. And the Lord in His sovereignty will